On September 5, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt walked back into a headquarters building in the west that still smelled like old cigar smoke and bad news. He hadn't been there in 2 months. In July of 1944, he had been pushed aside after telling Hitler's staff what they didn't want to hear, that Normandy was a disaster and that Germany should seek peace before the entire Western Front collapsed. Men were not rewarded for honesty in Hitler's war. They were removed, shamed, and replaced by optimists. But now the optimists had run out of miracles. Hitler was calling Rundstedt back, and that single fact told him everything. The situation was no longer difficult. It was desperate. Inside, General Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff at OB West, was waiting with maps spread across a table like an autopsy. The lines and symbols didn't look like a front. They looked like a body that had been torn open. 6 weeks earlier, the Allies had broken out of Normandy. What followed wasn't a measured advance. It was a chase across France, faster than German planning had ever considered possible. Cities were falling. Roads were filling with retreating columns. Entire regions had been liberated in what felt like a single breath. Blumentritt pointed to the southern sector, where the American Third Army was cutting across the landscape like a blade. Patton. In barely 3 weeks, Patton had torn through hundreds of miles, and his forward elements were now close enough to the German border that it no longer felt theoretical. There was, on the map, an emptiness between Patton and the heart of Germany that should have terrified any professional soldier. Rundstedt stared at the space between those American spearheads and the German frontier. Then, he asked the question that he already knew the answer to. Because the silence before Blumentritt spoke was the silence of a man searching for something that wasn't there. What do we have to stop him with? Blumentritt didn't dress it up. He didn't pretend there were hidden divisions behind the lines or a reserve waiting to strike. He didn't offer a clever plan or a comforting phrase. He said one word, flat and final. Nothing. That one word explains the true German condition in early September of 1944 better than any speech Hitler ever made. This wasn't merely a retreat. This was the near-total collapse of German military power in Western Europe. Most people imagine Germany in 1944 as bruised, but still formidable, still a machine that could grind forward if it needed to. That image belongs to earlier years, when German armies moved with confidence and purpose. By early September, in the West, it was no longer a machine. It was a structure that had cracked and begun to fall inward. Be precise about what Rundstedt and Blumentritt were seeing. Between Patton's forward positions and the German border, there were no intact German divisions standing in a coherent defensive belt. The formations that had fought in France were shattered, scattered, or fleeing east in a disorder that made command and control a fantasy. Many units had abandoned heavy equipment simply to move faster. A panzer regiment without fuel is just steel waiting to be captured. An artillery battalion without ammunition is dead weight. The soldiers, still holding rifles, were often doing so without orders, without radios, and without any confidence that someone behind them was directing the fight. And then there was the West Wall, the Siegfried Line, the famous defensive belt of bunkers and obstacles that the world believed guarded Germany like a stone fist. On paper, it was terrifying. In reality, at that moment, it was closer to a stage set. Concrete shells, many stripped of troops and weapons long before, drained to feed the Eastern Front. The bunkers still existed, yes, but many were empty or undermanned, lacking the ammunition and organization needed to stop an armored thrust moving at full speed. Fortifications without men are just concrete. Fortifications without supply are just tombs waiting to be occupied. To understand the German mindset in those days, don't picture disciplined marching columns. Picture roads choked with fragments of an army that had lost its spine. German officers described scenes of disintegration, burning trucks, overturned horse-drawn carts in ditches, men throwing away gear to run faster, units melting into the countryside, the desperate instinct of survival replacing the old pride of discipline. Communications were broken, orders became rumors. The German officer class raised on control and structure found itself staring at humiliation so absolute it was hard to describe without sounding like exaggeration. Years later, German commanders were remarkably candid about this period, because by then the war was over and the excuses had run dry. In post-war interrogations and studies, they provided details that make early September look less like a difficult operational moment and more like a cliff edge. General Siegfried Westphal, an operations officer at OB West, estimated that in the first days of September, the entire Western Front possessed the effective combat power of only a limited number of divisions, and even those were not divisions in the way people imagine. A German division on paper should have had a large, structured manpower strength, heavy weapons, artillery, transport, staff, and supplies. What Germany had in the West were remnants, formations reduced to a fraction of their expected numbers, short of fuel, short of ammunition, short of heavy weapons, and in many cases, short of the morale required to hold a line against a rapidly advancing enemy with air superiority. Now contrast that with Patton's Third Army. Patton's force in that sector was not a pile of remnants. It was a coherent, aggressive field army with multiple divisions, a command system that functioned, and momentum that acted like a multiplier. Even where American supply lines were stretched, the Third Army still had the organizational health to exploit any weakness it found. That's what terrified Rundstedt, not just American numbers, but American tempo. When you are disorganized, and your opponent is moving faster than you can think, the battlefield stops being geography and becomes time. You don't lose miles, you lose hours. The most critical German problem wasn't even the front line. It was what every competent commander knows matters most: reserves. Reserves are what you hold back so you can respond to breakthroughs, seal gaps, and launch counterattacks. They are the insurance policy that turns panic into plan. In early September, Germany had no meaningful reserves in the West. That fact alone is fatal when the enemy's spearheads are armored. Infantry can dig in. Infantry can delay. Infantry can die in place. But infantry alone cannot reliably stop an armored breakthrough that has momentum, especially if the enemy controls the skies. To stop tanks, you need tanks' armored counterattack forces that can strike the spearhead's flanks and disrupt the advance. Germany did not have those ready. The panzer divisions that had fought in Normandy were destroyed, exhausted, or in the slow process of being rebuilt far behind the line. Others existed on lists but were at a fraction of strength, still forming, still gathering equipment, not combat ready when hours mattered. Westphal and other German officers later said this with a bluntness that is almost painful. If Patton had been able to maintain his pace in early September, if his logistics had not forced him to slow, German forces could not have stopped him short of the Rhine, and perhaps not even there. German intelligence, even in chaos, remained skilled at tracking Allied movements. They knew where Patton was. They knew what his pattern meant. They also began to hear the one thing that gave them hope. Patton was struggling with fuel. They understood that his greatest threat was not a single battle, but his ability to keep moving. The irony was cruel Germany, which had once built its victories on speed, now depended on slowing an enemy who used speed even more brutally. 2 days after Rundstedt returned, he sent a situation report to Hitler's headquarters. He had spent those days assessing the front, and the news was worse than even he had expected. The report was grim. If the Americans continued at their current pace, German forces would be unable to prevent a Rhine crossing within a short time. He requested immediate reinforcements, fresh divisions, preferably armored. The response from Hitler's staff was not a solution, it was a question. Where would those divisions come from? The Eastern Front was devouring everything. There were no strategic reserves. Rundstedt was effectively told to manage disaster with what he had, which, in practical terms, meant managing it with almost nothing. And then something happened that German commanders could not understand at first, because it didn't fit the logic of war. Patton's advance slowed dramatically over a few days, and then it nearly stopped. Units that had been surging forward at breathtaking rates were now sitting still or moving only in small, cautious increments. German intelligence officers monitoring American radio traffic began reporting what sounded impossible. Severe fuel shortages, tanks immobilized, operations curtailed, the Americans consolidating rather than driving. At first, German commanders suspected deception. Patton was the kind of enemy you assumed was always setting a trap. Perhaps he wanted the Germans to believe his spearheads were slowing so they would expose themselves, concentrate in the wrong place, or rush reserves into a kill zone. But the days passed. The Third Army remained largely stationary. The pattern didn't shift. It became clear this wasn't deception. It was logistics. Patton, who had been pushing like a knife, had been stopped not by German resistance, but by empty fuel gauges. In Rundstedt's headquarters, the relief was almost physical. It was the kind of relief that makes men sit down because their legs suddenly remember they can collapse. For the German command, it felt like receiving a reprieve they hadn't earned. For American tankers, the moment was surreal. For weeks their world had been motion. Engines roaring, tracks clanking, dust clouds, adrenaline, the electric certainty that the enemy was breaking ahead of them. Then suddenly, quiet. Thousands of men parked along roads in late summer sun, staring at maps that showed empty space ahead, feeling in their bones that the enemy was shattered and the road was open, and realizing they could not take it because the lifeblood of movement wasn't arriving. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It felt like watching a door swing open and then being told you were not allowed to walk through it. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, German commanders described that pause with language that bordered on disbelief. They used words that suggested something miraculous had happened. These were not romantic men prone to superstition. They were professional officers, trained to analyze war as cause and effect. Yet they reached for near mystical phrasing because they could find no rational military reason why the Americans would stop at the moment Germany was most vulnerable. Some referred to it as a miracle in the West, echoing the old language of unexpected salvation. Rundstedt later wrote that the halt of Patton's Third Army in early September was inexplicable from a purely military standpoint. Patton had the strength, the position, and the momentum. That he did not push to the Rhine felt like a gift Germany had no right to expect. Blumentritt was even more direct in interrogation. When Patton was halted, German commanders could not understand it. The Americans had stopped themselves at the moment Germany was least able to resist, and Germany did what every competent army does when it receives a reprieve. It exploited time like a weapon. Between early September and late autumn, the Germans accomplished something that shocked Allied intelligence: a rapid reconstruction of Western defenses. This wasn't post-war myth. Allied reports tracked the recovery and were alarmed by the speed. The first priority was to man the West Wall. Units that had been retreating in fragments were reorganized, reinforced, and pushed into defensive positions. Training battalions were rushed forward, personnel not originally intended for infantry work, ground crews, sailors, any bodies that could hold a rifle, were formed into makeshift units and sent west. Concrete bunkers that had been empty shells began to fill with men, guns, and ammunition. What had looked like hollow fortification began turning into a real defensive belt. The second priority was rebuilding armored strength. Germany's industrial output in late 1944, despite bombing and pressure, still produced tanks. Production wasn't the only issue. Transport and organization were. A tank in a factory is not a tank in a battle. A tank in a rail yard is not a tank in a counterattack. With the front stabilized, Germany gained the one resource it needed more than steel: time to form units, repair vehicles, refit survivors, and rebuild command structures. Panzer divisions battered in Normandy began to reappear, not as the unbeatable spearheads of earlier years, but as capable formations that could defend, counterattack, and bleed an attacker. The German military recorded its movements meticulously, and post-war analysis of their order of battle shows exactly how the West was reinforced as weeks passed. Divisions were transferred from other duties and other fronts. Newer, lower-quality formations, Volksgrenadier divisions made from older men, young recruits, and recovered wounded, were raised and deployed to hold lines, man artillery, and delay. These were not elite troops, but they were enough to fill trenches, operate guns, and create friction for an advancing army. By the time autumn deepened, Germany had transformed the West from a near-empty shell into a defensive system with depth, manned fortifications, and the beginnings of reserves. And the most significant consequence of Patton's forced pause was not simply that Germany rebuilt its line. It was that Germany gained the time required to plan something far more dangerous: the Ardennes counteroffensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. That offensive was not improvised on a whim. It required months of preparation, stockpiling ammunition, gathering fuel, concentrating forces without tipping off Allied intelligence, and assembling large formations that could punch through a weak point and create shock. German commanders later testified that such an operation would have been impossible if the Americans had maintained relentless pressure in September. The troops needed for a winter counterattack would have been consumed defending the Rhine approaches. The fuel would have been burned in defensive battles. Surprise would have evaporated. But because the front stabilized and the Germans were given breathing room, Hitler's staff had time to dream up one last gamble, and the German army had time to build the tools to execute it. On December 16, 1944, that gamble erupted out of the Ardennes with brutal surprise. It drove a deep bulge into American lines, created chaos, and inflicted enormous casualties. It delayed the Allied advance and forced commanders to fight a harsh winter battle that did not need to happen if Germany had been denied the months required to prepare it. When Third Army eventually regained sufficient supplies to push again, the character of the war had changed. The Germans, who had been running in panic weeks earlier, were now dug into prepared positions. Artillery was registered, minefields were laid, defensive lines had shape and depth. Instead of racing across open country against scattered resistance, American forces were forced into systematic assaults against fortified positions. Progress became measured not in dozens of miles but in hard-won yards. Casualties rose, weather worsened, air support became less reliable. The war that might have ended in the bright confidence of late summer became the grinding, ugly attrition struggle of autumn and winter. There is a tragic poetry to how the weather seemed to mirror the shift. When Patton was racing across France, the sun shone on the roads of liberation. When the supply flow returned and attacks resumed against hardened defenses, the rains came, skies turned grey, fields became mud, and optimism leaked away. Men who might have ended the war in summer uniforms found themselves shivering in foxholes, fighting for frozen ground. The easy war, the pursuit war, was gone. The hard war had arrived. Months later, when Patton finally crossed the Rhine on March 22, 1945, it was not the same moment it could have been in early autumn. By spring, Germany was already dying, resistance was collapsing. The crossing was bold, but the opportunities of September were long gone. Patton knew it. In his private reflections, he expressed bitter frustration that the Rhine had been delayed so long. He believed that if his army had reached the river in early autumn, German resistance would have cracked, and the war would have ended months earlier. German commanders, astonishingly, largely agreed. After Germany's surrender, American interrogators questioned senior German officers at length to understand what had happened and what might have happened. The question of Patton's early September pause surfaced repeatedly because American officers wanted to know whether continuing the advance would have been feasible and whether the pause had truly saved Germany from immediate collapse. German testimony was consistent. They lacked the forces to stop Patton. The West Wall was not properly manned in the critical window. Reserves were absent. Coherent defense was not ready. Senior German operational staff acknowledged that if the American advance had continued without an operational pause, the Rhine could have been reached quickly, and Germany would have been forced into a defensive crisis it might not have survived. This is where the story stops being about maps and becomes about time, as a currency paid in lives. Historians debate timelines, and counterfactuals will always remain arguments, but the core lesson is painfully clear. In war, an operational pause at the moment of decision can be a gift of priceless value to a defeated enemy. The Germans understood exactly how valuable that time was, because they used every day of it. They rebuilt defenses that did not exist. They formed units that had not been ready. They constructed a reserve system that had been absent. They planned an offensive that would later cost tens of thousands of casualties. German post-war studies emphasized operational tempo for a reason. When you have an enemy running, you do not give him time to regain balance. Pressure turns retreat into collapse. Pause turns collapse into recovery. Logistics matters. Every officer knows it. But logistics that halts an army at the decisive moment can alter a campaign's entire human cost. Years later, when asked to assess what the pause meant, German commanders described it as one of the most significant turning points in the Western campaign after Normandy, not because it changed who would win, but because it changed who would live. Germany's 6 months of regained time did not save the Reich. It saved German armies from immediate destruction and allowed them to fight longer. And war fought longer means more cemeteries, more amputations, more telegrams delivered to doorsteps. That is the weight of the early September halt. It was not only a strategic shift, it was a human tragedy hidden inside a logistical problem, an enemy on the brink receiving an unexpected reprieve, using it with ruthless efficiency, and making the Allied soldiers pay for the delay later in the forests, in the snow, in the mud, and on the riverbanks where the war's final barriers were crossed, months after the road had once been open.